The big question, the big domestic question in Finland at the moment is about how much reliance we should put on bioenergy. You know, as you traveled across Finland, you must have seen the forests around you. There's quite a lot of it, but there are some critical, for example, researchers who think that putting all their eggs in the basket of biofuels, bioenergy, is not perhaps very wise. As you burn anything, you release CO2 out of it. The question is how long it takes to sequester in the carbon cycle, and this is the sort of domestic debate we are having, whether our actions, if we rely heavily on biofuels, will actually contribute to reducing emissions, or whether they will actually increase them in the short term. But I would say that other than that, most of the political parties, for example, are very progressive in terms of shift towards low carbon economy. Like I said earlier, in terms of the liquid transport fuels, there just even if with vast amounts of forest, there isn't enough, and if there isn't enough forests to fuel our economy and our energy system in Finland, how will there be enough forests in the rest of the world? So we have to rely on other sources as well. Hydropower is sort of out of the picture because it's been banned basically to expand existing hydropower capabilities. So it leaves, by this sort of deduction, you will have only a couple of energy sources left. One of them is wind power, and another one is nuclear energy. Some people are expecting solar power to be a big thing in here, but I have some doubts myself, because you only have to spend one winter here and you will understand why. It tends to correlate negatively with our consumption. We have a very new, fresh strategy that was really energy strategy that was released or sort of published only this year or end of last year, which the current government and probably the next governments will, to an extent, will work on. Next interesting thing is sort of electricity markets, since they are regional, to an extent even European, continental, let's put it that way. The sort of downside of the recent, there are different reasons for why the electricity prices are so low at the moment, so that nobody wants to invest unless they are given some subsidies. I'm sure this is very sort of a familiar sort of trick, sort of problem that you've come across with. I think European countries need to start talking to each other and what they're doing in terms of, for example, new renewable energy targets. If, for example, Swedish wind power has been impacting Finnish electricity prices the most in the past couple of years, and it's funny that they don't even consider it as a sort of issue that impacts their neighbors. So we have to increase that sort of dialogue, cross-national dialogue in Europe. Then I would say that it will be interesting to see what happens to the European emissions trading system, especially now that it looks like as if the European economy is starting to recover after 10-year slump. There's been a lot of measures put into the ETS to fix it in order to sort of increase the price of the emission allowances. But now we might see, who knows, but we might see a very quick rise in electricity prices as well as emissions prices. And then I think it'll be interesting to see how the sort of manufacturing industry, for example, or process industries, they will react. They will start shouting that it's too expensive. We can't compete with China and the US and so on and so forth. So it might go to the other sort of extreme in that sense. So it's another interesting aspect to follow up to. What will happen to the ETS? Actually, the share of nuclear energy will grow in Finland. It's going to be about, in next 10-15 years, I would say it's going to be about 40% nuclear, 50% renewables, and 10% fossil fuels in terms of the electricity mix. An interesting thing an interesting thing is what will happen with heat and transport fuels. If electric cars won't, with the current sort of battery system, won't be able to displace internal combustion engines, we will have to come up with ways of making fuel, for example, from hydrogen. And for that you need a lot of electricity or a lot of heat. So nuclear energy can play an important part, as well as renewable energy sources over there. And then there's heat, both heating of space heating and heating water for domestic and services use, as well as heat for industry. And I think that the energy policy discussion, both in Finland and in Europe, hasn't really really had a serious discussion and debate about how to decarbonize heat. And there I see that it will be very, very difficult to do this sort of these sort of targets that we have in Europe without having nuclear energy as part of the mix. And I mean, you just have to do it responsibly. I think it can be a very important part of the mix, but if you do it in a bad way, then of course I don't think it deserves a place in the energy mix. As part of the current energy winter package that the Commission launched or published March last year, there's quite a lot of discussion in the legislation about energy poverty, and that's another thing, another target that if it's a very important issue. I mean, nobody should have to pay too big of a share of their pay to energy costs. So it's an important issue, and from a pragmatic angle again, but I don't consider it as an energy policy issue, but rather a social policy issue. You should sort of relieve poverty through social policy, which is usually takes place on the domestic level, rather than set policies from the European level to reduce energy poverty, because this makes legislation around energy much more complex, unnecessarily complex. You could mention it in the sort of background text. We need to make sure that this transition doesn't leave people behind. We need to make sure that energy costs are not too high. But if we sort of include those things in the European Union legal texts, when they get implemented on a national level, it can make a real mess. And so it's just a pragmatic point rather than anything else. Very often people have a very sort of light view, not sort of very analytical view about what sustainability is. And in practice, this can be seen as society's approach to different technologies that might be actually very sustainable. For example, genetically engineered crops in agriculture. They could be very beneficial for the environment, but then society as a whole considers them very often very sort of harmful. Nuclear energy is a similar kind of technology, which when used correctly, it can be of huge benefit for the environment because of zero CO2 emissions, as well as low sort of natural resources requirements, but still it is considered as environmentally problematic energy source, which it partly is. A few examples. I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but as we started with that sort of thing in the beginning, I would like to see the subsidies phased out so that the European emissions trading system, its role could be reinforced. One of the most irresponsible things a country can do to itself is to create industries that are dependent on government subsidies. It will require a lot of political balls, basically, to pull the plug out of those industries. By shifting from subsidizing renewable sector. We need to really see them sort of grow up, and I would like to see the emission trading system to be that sort of tool, because at the moment fossil fuels are simply too cheap that renewables or nuclear can sort of compete with them.